Starting at the far end there, we have Rabbi Lord Sachs, formerly the chief rabbi, and also currently the professor of law and ethics at King's College London, and what's called global professor at New York University. And he, of course, is very well known to you because he was perhaps the most important chief rabbi from leading the community discussion out into the wider world and putting values right in the forum of public discussion, for example, on Thought for the Day on Radio 4. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, had a tremendous admiration, which she picked up by being member for Finchley, for Judaism and what it could teach Western society. And she loved Emanuel Jakobowitz, who was Jonathan Sachs's predecessor as chief rabbi, and she said that she wanted to make him Archbishop of Canterbury. It wasn't possible, but it was helpful. He was very helpful to her, and I think she in some ways to him. And then we have Richard Chartres, very, very long-serving, but sadly now just recently retired Bishop of London, who did so much for this diocese, and who's famous, justly so, or should be if he isn't, for never having closed a church the whole time he ran that diocese. It's a unique record in the Church of England in modern times. Richard is very well known to you as a superb preacher and thinker and a great figure in our state occasions. And in a particular point, of course, he was there to say, I thought very perceptive and healing words over the coffin of Lady Thatcher in St. Paul's Cathedral 4 years ago. And here we have Anne Applebaum, who I claim, though I believe it's false, to be the first person to publish her in Britain. A brilliant journalist, a very great expert on all the issues we're talking about, a columnist for the Washington Post, and a great historian of the Cold War. And I think because we need some sort of context of history to look at this question that we're coming into, I want Anne to set the scene for us, and then we'll go on from there. Anne.
That's all right. Well, thank you very much. I'm really flattered to be in this extraordinary room and on this distinguished panel in which I'm the only member who's not a representative of organized religion, so I'll have to somehow compensate.
I'm disorganized.
You're disorganized religion. Well, that's good. So one of the obvious points about the idea of the West is that, of course, it has very old origins, both in Greece and Rome and in Judeo-Christianity. And I think I'll leave my co-panelists to talk about that. The political West, of course, is something that exists since 1945, and it doesn't really appear before that, except in earlier forms. And it exists. It was an organized. It was an organized project designed to oppose totalitarianism. And it had an institutional face and it had an ideological face. And the institutions were the ones that we know. They were NATO, they were the European Union, the various world trade agreements, the agreements by which the nations of what we called the West cooperated together and worked together in order to increase their own prosperity and also to oppose, both militarily and ideologically, the challenge from the Soviet system. It was also an ideological agreement, and of course there were many disputes over the years over what exactly that meant. But of course, very roughly, we know the answer. It was an agreement that we are all democracies, and that we feel not only that we are democracies, but that we believe democracy is a better system than other systems. And it was also an agreement that free markets, again, very roughly, the free markets tempered by social redistribution, of course, in many countries, but that free markets are the best way to conduct an economy and spread prosperity. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, became the embodiment of that set of beliefs in 1989 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, first when the Soviet Empire collapsed, and then later the Soviet Union. And she and not just Reagan, but George Bush Sr. And the other leaders of the West became looked in that year like they'd won that argument. The democracy narrative had triumphed over the narrative of Soviet dictatorship. And the West began to organize itself actually even more closely around that set of ideas, almost with a kind of hubris. We won that argument. Democracy is now unchallenged. The most famous, of course, statement of this came from the American philosopher Frank Fukuyama, who wrote, "This is the end of history. Democracy has triumphed. There's really no argument against it now. It's just a matter of time before everybody else joins our institutions and our set of ideas." And actually, over the subsequent 25 years, some of that did seem to come true. There was the very successful integration of Central and Eastern Europe into the West, both an institutional integration, mostly carried out by the European Union, but also by the expansion of NATO. But then there was a very unsuccessful attempt to project that further into the Arab world, partly by military force, and that failed. That was a very rough and fast jump through 25 years. What we have ended up with, though, at the end of that quarter century, is something that we didn't expect, which is a moment where that very fundamental narrative, the one that carried the West through the Cold War and that carried us through about a quarter century after 1989, is now fundamentally under challenge. It's challenged in this country, it's challenged in the United States, it's challenged on the West European continent. And there are a lot of reasons for that I won't discuss all of them here. I would point to two things that we didn't expect in 1989 and that have become profoundly clear as sources of instability in the last 2 or 3 years, but particularly in the last year. One of them is the one that was alluded to at the end of the previous panel, which is the disruptive nature of the internet and of social media. We knew that it was an economic disruptor, but the degree to which it's a disruptor of politics, the way in which social media has undermined political parties, has undermined traditional sources of authority and trust. These are things that we didn't expect. Nobody really expected them. The way in which the internet has also allowed people to reorganize themselves in order to, in a sense, find new identities online and operate through those rather than through traditional political parties was not something we expected. And it has led to really a collapse of the traditional political party in many Western countries with some of the consequences that we've seen today. I think the second thing that we didn't expect, and this will maybe be not what some of you, it's kind of counterintuitive, and that is the reemergence of Russia, a country that we sort of dismissed in 1991 as really, just a question of time before Russia joins us. They lost the Cold War. They're now on a path to democracy. They're going to be part of our civilization and our institutions very soon, and that was our policy towards them in the 1990s. Instead, what has happened is the transformation of Russia, once again, I would argue, into a country which organizes itself and identifies itself as anti-Western, and as a country which is dedicated to undermining the West. And it does that through both through using tools of social media that I think in ways that we didn't foresee, using bots and troll farms and other tools that emphasize the disruptive nature of the internet, but also through funding anti-Western political parties of the far right and of the far left, and also through promoting corruption and kleptocracy that has helped undermine economics and create economic imbalances all across the West. There are other sources of instability in the West as well. Obviously, the rise of radical Islam, but more generally, what Russia and what the internet have shown us is that the appeal of the alternatives to democracy, the appeals of the anti-democratic narrative, are still very much there. We did not disinvent authoritarianism or the attraction of authoritarianism in 1989. The appeal of, a strong man, somebody who makes decisions without fuffing around with these democratic, checks and balances and due process. The appeal of violence, the idea that we can eliminate problems quickly and easily, and really the appeal of much more forms of ethnic and religious identity that are anti-democratic. I think we didn't understand that in 1989, and that I think have come to the fore in recent Western elections. I will leave the further discussion to my other panelists. I mean, obviously, I believe that the fight back of democracy, or the way in which we can reassert the democracy narrative, will require us to really identify the problems that are coming from Russia, that are coming from the internet, and find new ways of asserting the Western ideas in the face of those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, very much. And Anne's mention of the internet reminds me what I should have said before, is that please send in your tweets and so forth before the panel, by the time the panel have finished their opening remarks, and no trolling, please. We'll be getting that from wider sources, I expect. Now, I think this moves very easily to Jonathan Sacks. I know, Jonathan, you were interested in taking up the idea of democracy and going further in all of that. Please tell us what you have to say.
Yes, Charles, can I add what a privilege it is to be in this forum and to have had the privilege of listening to Henry Kissinger, and it's just reformulated a song of my youth, which should now go, will you still need me, will you still heed me, when I'm 94, which is a source of hope that I wasn't expecting to have this morning, and I feel much energized by it. The real question I want to pose is, which Western values, which West? And here I want to turn to a distinction made by one of Margaret Thatcher's favorite thinkers, Friedrich Hayek, who in the Constitution of Liberty distinguishes between two traditions of human rights, what he calls the Anglo-American and the French. And they are very, very distinct. The French one famously, the Revolutionary Declaration of les droits de l'homme et de le citoyen of 1789, all men are born and remain equal in rights. And the American Declaration, influenced by Locke via Jefferson, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They sound similar. They are, in fact, extremely different in three respects. Number one, the French Declaration is clearly and emphatically a secular one. The American one is clearly and emphatically a religious one. It talks about the Creator endowing human beings with rights. That is what Tocqueville meant when he said that in France I saw the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty marching in opposite directions, but in America I found them going hand in hand. Second, the French formula was a formula for maximal government. In other words, human rights constitute an ideal template which it is the job of governments to implement. The Anglo-American tradition was a formula for limited government. Rights were not something guaranteed by the state. To the contrary, there was a statement of saying that there are certain areas, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which are bluntly not the state's business. It's a formula for limited government. And number three, the French formula was based on atomic individuals, separate from their constitutive attachments, their families, communities, faith traditions, and so on. It's a point that Burke made very forcibly at the time. Whereas the Anglo-American one was predicated on a very strong civil society, families, congregations, communities, charities, and all the rest of it, standing between the individual and the state. So you had two very different traditions in the West. And the cultural climate change, almost unnoticed, that has happened in the past half century is that the French version has taken over the elites in both England and America. So we are all French now. Now, this is pretty bad news for anyone who believes that the Anglo-American tradition has something to be said for it. The French tradition leaves very little between the individual and the state, and the end result of that is when the individual feels that the state is not meeting its needs, it turns to populist politics, because private individuals, shorn of families and communities which are dying on their feet in Britain and America, feels powerless and hence turns to strong leaders to defeat A, the current elites, and B, the outsiders, whoever those outsiders are. And populist politics is the beginning of the end of liberty. So I would like to see a reinstatement of those Anglo-American values, at least in England and America, because the greatest danger facing the West is not the one we've been talking about. The one we've been talking about is real and significant. We have 4 ancient and extremely dignified civilizations that have felt marginalized by the modern world and are now reasserting themselves, namely Russia, China, India, and Islam. Those 4 traditions are reasserting themselves in powerful ways, and there's not a lot we in the West can do except hope that it happens in a benign way. The great danger is the moral vacuum at the heart of Western political structures. The French system believes that liberty is a political achievement. The Anglo-American tradition believes that freedom is at least also a moral achievement. And without that moral substance, born and cultured and cultivated in families, communities, and traditions, some religious and some national, the West will be left with a vacuum out of which disorder will follow.
Thank you very much. Very good. Thank you. Well, again, with a certain logic, we move on. We have 2 men of God here, the same God, but what you might call a different franchise. And now let's hear Richard Chartres.
Do I hear a great rain?
Yes, you do.
Well, I hope it's not going to be après-moi le déluge. But I want to approach what's been said from a slightly different angle. I was very impressed by Henry Kissinger's opposition between co-evolution and confrontation. And I think if we are going to move into something more like co-evolution, one of the first things that's required is a healthy dose of humility. There's been a rather hubristic application of the French version, I think, in the recent past. And I think the very first rule in becoming a mature human being is to refuse to be a little tin god. And there is very little possibility of co-evolution without that humility. But I want also to draw on Anne's comments on democracy, because, of course, that's at the center of what most people mean by Western values, but it's a disputable concept now for very important reasons, and some of which have been glanced at. It should be obvious that democracy requires, first and foremost, a demos, a people that cohere, some sense of shared moral compass, some coagulation, some songs to sing in common. One of the saddest things in this country is to go to all sorts of events and discover that people have virtually no shared memories, no songs to sing in common beyond that appalling ditty, "Happy Birthday to You." That's about it. So no songs to sing in common. And what happens is that the demos disintegrates. And what follows is, empowered by social media, a crowd of atomized individuals where there is a referendum a day. I spoke in the debate in Parliament on the referendum bill and invoked Burke because we have a democracy in the Anglo-American tradition that really provides time for reflection, for consolidating some consensus, which was another very brilliant aperçu of Henry Kissinger. Now we have a referendum a day, and the demos has disintegrated into a crowd of atomized individuals. And Aristotle examined this state of political evolution. And what he said was, what comes next is tyranny. And I think we are probably inoculated against strange little men in jackboots and toothbrush moustaches. But administrative tyranny, the tyranny of thousands of inspectors and regulators, I think in a way that Mrs. Thatcher would abominate, that kind of administrative tyranny is not inconceivable. So what's to be done if there is this evolution? It seems to me very obvious that we have to remember, we have to dig into the roots of the Western tradition once again. I used to be bishop in the East End. I remember being part of some very low-level rioting and going round saying we must respect other people's cultures, it's very important indeed. And I was confronted by one young man at one of the schools who said, well, what's my effing culture then, bish? He had a sense of real poverty, real absence. And I've kept in touch ever since with people who teach in the East End, people who are in our school system. And the accent on technique and skill leaves the curriculum virtually content-free when it comes to the sort of questions we're discussing here this morning. It seems absolutely obvious that throughout history, the question of how to live well has been a central question. It does not appear, it seems to me, beyond sexual and dietary good health. It doesn't really appear in our educational system. So if you want a demos, if you want to have a West where the best do not lack all conviction while the worst are full of a passionate intensity, we have to remember our roots and we have to reinvest in those little platoons, as Jonathan says. And I always remember a remark that you made about your father. Your father was also brought up in the East End. And you said about your father, he wasn't rich, but he certainly wasn't poor, because he had his family and he had his faith. And that seems to me to be something we can't neglect today.
Thank you very much. We're getting some questions in, but can I just take this a tiny bit further about the demos. Anne, you're obviously very worried, and I know from what you've written elsewhere, you're very hostile to Trump, and you're worried about Brexit. There's an argument that these are expressions of democracy, that the demos is getting very, very fed up with the elite, and that the demos has ceased to believe that there really is a democracy because somehow this elite is unreachable and doesn't listen to them. And so there's a desire to bring things home. In the case of Britain, actually bring sovereignty home, and in the case of America, for middle America to get power over Washington and so on. Is that all illusory? I mean, you're very worried about the dangers of that, but do you see why that tension would exist? And partly it's a tension between nationalism and internationalism.
Yes, I do see why the tension exists, and I do see why people are frustrated. What worries me, and what worried me in particular about the Trump campaign, is that what we're watching is, is a kind of set of false promises being made. So it's not just that Trump is saying, I'll bring home the decision-making. What he actually said to people was, I'm going to fix everything. If you remember his famous convention speech was, I can solve it, I will do it. And this is the classic, we saw this in Venezuela. There was actually a Bolshevik revolution version of this. We've seen it in other parts of the world. This is the classic strongman promise. And what Trump has done, even since being elected, has not been, to return power to the people or attempt to involve people in decision-making. He's done something quite different, which is to to sort of continue this string of lies and continue to, and really to keep power very secretive and to make actually the White House less transparent than it was before. So what we have just seen is people being duped into believing they were voting, maybe some people believing they were voting for something more democratic, and getting quite the opposite. I think Brexit is actually different from Trump, and I usually resist the comparison. Although what I do fear about Brexit is also that people were promised things that won't be delivered. And really what I'd like to return to in both cases is a problem that I think Western politics have had for the last couple of decades, which is almost as if, having defeated Marxism, we then adopted one of its tenets, namely the belief that politics is all about economics. Base determined superstructure. All the arguments to the electorate need to be made about, 1 point here or there in tax. The British actually are particularly guilty of this. I can remember many British election campaigns where, people were fighting over, will you pay more or less tax? Will this cost more or less? And I think a lot of Western politics, and particularly actually Anglo-American politics, and there are a lot of different reasons for this, have tended to focus on politicians saying, I can bring you prosperity and I'll make you richer. And that was the most important political argument. And the result of that is that people began to look for other things in politics. People want things out of politics other than money. Money is very important, and well-being is important, and prosperity is important, but people really have a broader definition of what politics should be. And I think in both of those two election campaigns, the referendum campaign and the American campaign, what I feared is that people felt they were being offered something bigger, some bigger idea or something that appealed, that was really a cultural appeal. And in the case of Trump, I think it was a sort of appeal to some kind of white Christian identity. And in the case of Brexit, an appeal to some idea of British sovereignty that people felt was higher than economics. One of the things I found striking about the Brexit campaign, I think Nigel Farage at one point was asked, aren't you worried that Britain will be poorer after this? And he essentially said, I don't care. This is more important. I worried that people were a little hoodwinked by that and they weren't listening carefully. But I do think that the offer of something greater than money explains those two campaigns, and it also partly explains the Macron campaign in France. Whereas you saw somebody who was also trying to offer people something more than just, you'll get richer. He wasn't arguing that at all. He was saying, I'm offering you a different vision of France. It's going to be hard for some people, but we need to adjust to the world and so on. So I think the solution is political, but not, in politicians understanding that there are higher things.
And on that the panel is agreed, but I don't want to lose track of the values point that Jonathan and Richard were talking about, but can I just pursue a bit further with them something arising from that, which is what, in the Cold War, there was a close association between what we rather loosely call values and strong politics about things like defense and security and the nature of alliances. And that was very much embodied both by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So Mrs. Thatcher first became famous in the world because of something she said about the Cold War, and that actually gave her name, the Iron Lady. That was given her by her opponents. It was given her by Red Star, the newspaper of the Red Army, who said she's the Iron Lady, and they meant it as a joke because it was a sexist joke. How could a woman be iron? And of course she saw how it was such a wonderful name to be given by her enemies, and she took it up with great joy. And there's a famous bit of film with her wearing a sort of chiffon evening gown and saying, yes, well, here I am with my hair gently waved and so on, but I don't mind being the Iron Lady of the Western world if that means I'm defending our values and our liberties against Soviet communism and so on. And so she saw, far from seeing, on the one hand, domestic stuff and personal values and family, and on the other hand, high global politics, she saw them all as together. Mm-hmm. And that was a very, very powerful message. Is that a message? It seems to be very hard to have that message now. Is that a statement about our morality, or is that because of the facts about the state of the world? Jonathan, do you?
I think Richard was right in mentioning the word demos. to have a democracy. And what Margaret Thatcher so expressed so powerfully is what it was to be British, what it was to be English. I don't want to get into that nuance. I remember when she first entered Parliament and she was described as a parliamentary bourgeoisie with Hansard in one hand and a hat pin in the other. And she was magnifique in that role. And she kind of embodied a national pride which very much identified with the people. She was, in that sense, a politician who appealed over the heads of the politicians to the people. And what's been breaking down in Britain and America is a sense of what that people is, or that beautiful phrase which is central to American politics, we the people. The reason I knew something was going askew in American politics is when the two most profound observers of American society, one from the right, Charles Murray of the American Enterprise Institute, one on the left, Robert Putnam of Harvard, both published books, Charles Murray, Coming Apart, Robert Putnam, Our Kids, which said in effect that the American story has broken down for half of America. Half of America, the America you read about in Hillbilly Elegy and Strangers in Their Own Land, the America of the, what do they call them, the flyover states, the poor whites. That half of America no longer identifies with the American story because social mobility has declined almost to frozen form today in the last 40 years. The vast mass of Americans have seen their real standards of living static or declining. The American dream is no longer theirs. Now take the English equivalent. I didn't close synagogues, but I did once in a while officiate at funerals. And I remember a whole generation of Anglo-Jews had engraved on their tombstones a proud Englishman and a proud Jew. Now, I can tell you today, Charles, what it is to be a proud Jew. I can't tell you what it is to be a proud Englishman. And that was what UKIP and what Brexit were trying to rectify. Our problems are global, but our only functioning political institutions are national. Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And therefore, we have to recover that sense of being in this together as a nation. And that is what is missing today from the elites. There are an awful lot of people who feel the elites are cosmopolitan and they owe no particular loyalty to this country or that. Yeah. And that is what we are failing in our duty to immigrants. Because when my parents came over, they knew exactly what it is to be English. Jews spoke Yiddish for 1,000 years. They said, what about one of my predecessors? That he spoke 10 languages, all of them Yiddish. And Jews lost Yiddish in one generation because my parents insisted, and all their generation insisted, that we, their children, were good Englishmen and women. Yeah. And today, for Muslims, for Sikhs, for Hindus coming into Britain, what is this national character to integrate into? Yes. And that is leaving them estranged. So strengthen the nation, and you will strengthen that entire constellation of values that allows the West to stand up for itself.
Thank you. Yeah. I just want to follow that up with one of Henry Kissinger's other marvelous perceptions, that there is an American view of a certain normality to which they were always trying to return the world by sorting out various problems. And I think the roots of what Jonathan's talking about are partly complacency. We've done very well out of history, and there is a sense that this is the normal pattern of life. And there's also a rather more sinister view that we're going to build a braver, happier, more tolerant world by purging memories, by abolishing memories. It's very interesting that in the introduction to his autobiography, Tony Blair says that he's going to describe the events of his premiership not as a historian, because obviously he has no patience with that, but as a leader. And one of the problems in life, of course, is that if you're just a person of memories and backward-looking, you're pretty tedious. But if you're a person of destiny and no sense of history, you're very dangerous. And we've got a mindset which has actually swept the room, and you don't exorcise the satanic by creating a spiritual vacuum. But how do you actually put remembering in the service of new challenges? And this is your question. The tectonic plates geopolitically are shifting. Unchallengeable Western hegemony, which has been the state for the last 250 years, is giving way to something more genuinely multipolar. So we come back to Henry Kissinger's co-evolution or confrontation. But you cannot have fruitful, creative co-evolution unless we're clear about what we bring to the marriage, about what our contribution is. And therefore, this idea that you create something more kind and tolerant by abolishing particular memories is exactly contrary to what we need to do.
Thank you. Can I just add one piece to that, which is that, I agree, your point about the demos and the point about being clear about what we stand for is, of course, vital to renewing our political systems and our democracy, in this country. But I would like to just remind you of Charles's original question, which is, isn't there also a point to be made about renewing the idea that we are a democracy in a community of democracies, and that there are ways in which, the fact that we live in this community, it helps reinforce our system too and our values as well. And so seeing Britain as connected to the United States, but also connected to France and Germany, in a thriving community in which we share values and in which we share ideals, is also part of that re-strengthening process. And I would, what I don't want to happen in Britain after Brexit is that Britain, shrinks into itself and sees this as something it needs to do as a single country. I want, actually, as Kissinger also said at the end of his remarks, I would like to see Britain also thinking about how to renew the global alliance, the transatlantic alliance, how to renew its relationships with Europe as a way of strengthening itself and looking beyond itself.
Thank you. I've got several questions, and really they circulate around roughly the same point. So I can pick almost any of them, and it'll come near to it. In an increasingly multicultural West, is it still important to continue asserting Judeo-Christian values, or is it now time for the West to move towards secularism? And there are other versions of this question, some more hostile to religion and some more favorable to it. And also, related to that, another question, you speak of Judeo-Christian values, but the questioner says, shouldn't you add Judeo-Christian Islamic values?
Well, you could say Abrahamic values.
Abrahamic, yeah.
Something like that. It seems to me that if you abandon that strand in our story, then it doesn't put you in a very good position to understand the stories of others, and it doesn't equip you with the ability to reach out and engage in this process of co-evolution. One of the most significant failings in our diplomacy and international relations is precisely the sense that surely all intelligent people are secular, and you can't possibly entertain any of these religious worldviews. And I think that's been one of the great weaknesses and one of the facts which has blinded us to developments in the rest of the world. So I would say that part of the remembering has to be the fact that all men are created equal. Where does that come from? These truths are not self-evident. They have not been self-evident to most of the world's cultures in most of its centuries. They come from the scriptural view that all human beings were created equal in the image of God. I mean, this is an astonishingly and explosively revolutionary concept, which is not at the center of many other cultures in the world.
I have a fairly unusual CV for a chief rabbi, namely that my primary school was St. Mary's Church of England Primary School, and my secondary school was called Christ College. That's in fact how I knew Margaret Thatcher first, because she was my local MP, and I was studying politics. And whenever I had an essay to write, I used to go along to her in her surgery and ask for her views on the subject at hand. And on one occasion, I had to write an essay on proportional representation. And I said to Mrs. Thatcher in her surgery, "What do you think about proportional representation?" And she looked at me and she said, "You're not a liberal, are you?" I declined to comment further on that one. But the fact that the schools I went to were confident in their Christian faith meant that they understood that just as their faith was important to them, so my faith was important to me. And the end result was I learned from that school a far more tolerant experience than I think I would have done had I gone to a secular school that regarded all faiths as nonsense. In fact, I never met among Christian and Muslim friends someone who was as intolerant as the new and very angry atheists. Never tell a joke to an angry atheist. They simply don't have a sense of humor. But so I think having a strong faith allows you to understand the significance of other faiths to other adherents, and indeed of the great humanist traditions as well. And I think the Church of England has been a magnificent exemplar of that, because it did make space for Catholics and Jews and Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims. So that's number one. I don't think Judeo-Christian values are the only ones that there are, and I respect Indian, Chinese, Russian, and others. But they are who we are, or who we historically were. And to have that confidence in those values is inclusive and embracing, and not in any sense exclusive. The other point I want to make, and it's a really important one, is that as I have researched it, the first account I have ever found in religious writing for freedom of speech comes from the great Muslim thinker of the 12th century, Averroes. Averroes is the first person who says that if you are confident in your faith, you need fear no opponent, therefore let them speak freely. Averroes, as a Muslim, is the first person I know who puts that view forward. It is then quoted by one of my ancestors, Rabbi Judah Loewy of Prague in the 16th century, in the name of Averroes. So Judaism got it from Islam. A half century later, John Milton makes the same point in his defense of free speech, Areopagitica. And then, of course, 2 centuries later on, a humanist, John Stuart Mill, makes the same case in On Liberty. So here is a lovely defense of tolerance and freedom, begun in Islam, then communicated to Judaism, then Christianity, then to a great humanist tradition. So I do think the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are a family here who should face the future confidently together in co-evolution.
By the way, in the Liberal Party, when it was still called the Liberal Party rather than the Liberal Democrats, every year at the party assembly, a copy of Milton's Areopagitica was handed from the one president to the next. And now they don't do that. They hand over Mill's Liberty. And it's as if they didn't like the religious aspect of it. So there's the same tradition, but they're worried by the religious aspect of it.
It's a tree that if you cut off its roots, I'm sad to say, will die.
Yes, but let's be tough about the Islamic question, because obviously, I imagine everyone in this room would applaud the attempt by Jews and Christians and Muslims to find common ground and to find the common tradition, which is obviously overwhelmingly there because of being Abrahamic. But that's not the whole story, is it? And we have a massive problem in this country right now, which expresses itself, and not only in this country, it's not special to this country, it has some special aspects. It expresses itself literally in people killing other people. And you can tell, if somebody walks into this room and shouts Allahu Akbar, I'm afraid we all duck down. Whereas if somebody comes in and shouts Jesus Christ is Lord, you just think he's a bit of a lunatic and try to sort of help him out of the room so we can continue with the proceedings. And so what is actually happening is that people are very, very frightened. And while it must be true that the people who are killing people in the name of Islam are not good Muslims, they are Muslims. And I saw a picture this weekend of the end of Eid being celebrated in Birmingham. And it was reported that 100,000 Muslims had come out and prayed to celebrate the end of Eid. And I asked myself, what do you actually feel about that? And I think a lot of people will feel a certain ambiguity. On the one hand, I was very impressed that a faith can bring out 100,000 people in an orderly way and they all pray. So they prayer is the great characteristic of religion. But on the other hand, do I really want enormous numbers of Muslims on my streets praying? Because in a way, by doing that, they're asserting something about their importance in the society and about, if you like, a sort of sense of taking ground. In other words, how much is this just a shared thing in which we all equally welcome one another, and how much do we feel threat? And even if we're completely wrong to feel threat, a lot of people do feel threat. So where does all this go? I mean, it's very hard to talk about because people worry, about causing offense, and rightly so, but it is important, isn't it? And it's not resolved, it's getting worse, actually. Do you want to say something, Anne?
I mean, I would begin by saying, remember that one of the other, we've had several quotations from the Declaration of Independence and the American founders, whose ideas, of course, came from this country. But one of the really important and central founding ideals of the United States of America, in fact, one of the reasons why people went there in the first place, was that it was a society which was founded as one that was religiously tolerant. And so while people had faith, and individuals had faith, and institutions and organizations had very deep faith, the state actually was secular from the beginning. And that enabled different kinds of people with different views to live within it, so long as they accepted that central value. And so I have to say that I'm not bothered by Muslims being organized and peacefully praying on the streets of Birmingham at all, because those are people who have accepted the central tenet of the society, of British society, which is that it is religiously tolerant, that it believes in the rule of law, that those people will not then threaten 100,000 Christians if they want to come to celebrate Mass either. What I think does threaten this country and what threatens the West are forms of religious fanaticism that are profoundly intolerant, and the form of Islam that is intolerant, and actually the sort of white supremacist Christian ideology, which is also very intolerant, which we've seen in the United States, and which is the form of Christianity promoted by Putinism. These I feel to be genuine threats, and these are things I'm afraid of, and I feel that we should try to defeat. So I'm not sure that. Religion means nothing when you say in general, all religions are good. That doesn't mean anything. What we mean in the West by religion's positive contribution is the kind of religion we hear on this panel, which is a view of religion that that is profoundly tolerant and profoundly accepting of democratic values.
One of our problems, of course, is a sheer lack of religious literacy.
Yes.
And one of the difficulties about our approach to the rest of the world is the attempt to empty religious fanaticism, about which you're talking, into other categories, supremely economic categories. This is poverty, this is all sorts of things other than religion. It reminds me of the situation in Ireland until comparatively recently, where the first thing you'd be told was, of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with religion, well, which is evidently absurd. What we've got is false and lethal religion, and we don't have the categories, the understanding, to realize what idolatry is. Idolatry is making a god in your own image, and what we've got at the moment is bruised and humiliated egos surreptitiously reascending to worship some projection of their own rage and lust for power. It's got to be taken seriously in terms of, as Muslim scholars do. I used to be co-chairman of a body with Ali Gomar, the previous and very distinguished Grand Mufti of Egypt. And we were utterly agreed that this particular phenomenon had to be identified in its theological terms as an idolatrous perversion of the faith. And you need all sorts of responses to what faces us. You need, of course, much greater security. You need to finance the police. You also have to have a rather greater religious literacy.
But there is a relation between, it's not only ideas here and beliefs, it's also to do with world power. Yeah. Because, and I wanted to ask, because in a post-Cold War era, how does that begin to feel? I mean, for example, in Britain, the first time we felt this issue, and it was related to world power, really was when Mrs. Thatcher, at the end of her time, had to deal with the Salman Rushdie affair. He published the Satanic Verses, and the Ayatollah Khomeini put a fatwa on him saying you must go and kill him. And so this was an act of a head of state, who was effectively a head of state, I can't remember whether he literally was the head of state, Ayatollah Khomeini, telling Muslims that it was a Muslim act to go and kill Salman Rushdie. And Mrs. Thatcher had this difficult problem of actually not liking anything that Rushdie had said, and he actually calls her Mrs. Torture in the course of the Satanic Verses, so she wasn't a big friend of his, but she knew she had to defend his right to write such a book. And she was being confronted on the one, both by riots and protests and book burning in England, so that's directly her affair, and by global attempts to come in and assassinate Rushdie because he was ordered to do so by a foreign power. And I wonder how you see, so in the end of the communist era, should we now see Islamism as a sort of a power force as well as a power political force as well as a ideological question, religious
Charles,
question?
I feel very, very strongly about this issue, and I've written the strongest book I've ever written called Not in God's Name on this issue, directed at Jews, at Christians and Muslims collectively and individually. I think Anne's point is important, but it's important to understand that it was born as a religious idea, the separation of religion and power. One of the most radical statements of the Hebrew Bible is the separation of powers between kings, priests, and prophets, which gets taken up by Montesquieu and then by the Federalist Papers. A king cannot be a high priest can't be a king. So you had separation of power, civil power, from religion. Then along comes Christianity and says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. So you have there a principled separation of religion and power. But that is theory. In practice, whenever a religion is offered power, it can never resist the temptation. And the end result is that if you look at history, it takes trauma to force religions to reconsider. And the Abrahamic faiths have all gone through this trauma. Judaism went through it in the first century, when within besieged Jerusalem, with the Roman troops outside, the Jews were more busy killing one another than confronting the enemy outside. And as a result of which, Judaism became demilitarized, a pacific faith that depoliticized itself and saw peace as the highest value. That happened in the first century. Christianity, which was born 15 centuries later, has its own crisis 15 centuries later, in the 16th century, when Europe is torn apart by wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. starting in France, culminating in the 30 Years' War, and that is when the Treaty of Westphalia is born in 1648 as an attempt to create countries in which Catholics and Protestants can live together in peace. And that is when Christianity learned to separate religion from power. Today, the same thing is happening in the world of Islam, between Sunni and Shia, between radical and moderate, between all sorts of internal things. And we forget that the primary victims of Islamist violence are Muslims. And when Muslim thinkers reach the conclusion that the rabbis reached, or that Milton, Hobbes, and Locke and Spinoza reached in the 17th century, that whatever God wants, he doesn't want us killing other members of our own faith. When that happens, the separation of religion and power will occur within Islam. At the moment, Islam is going through great turbulence, and it's very important for us to feel this, not to simply condemn it blindly, but to remain strong in our own conviction that as religious people we believe that religion should have influence, but should never, ever aspire to power.
It's very fascinating, isn't it, that nobody would have thought if we'd had this conference in the last years of the Cold War that we'd all be talking about religion in the 21st century as a sort of one of the great questions and issues in all of this.
Charles, you said it yourself. In 1989, when Francis Fukuyama was announcing the end of history, that was when the fatwa against Salman Rushdie was issued. So it was at that very moment that we should have taken notice.
So and we didn't pay enough attention. The thing we had in the Cold War, and here we should end really, I should just ask for very short remarks from each of the panel. In a way, the Cold War was sort of morally simple, wasn't it? I mean, the great majority of people in the Western world, though not everybody, I mean, not, for example, Jeremy Corbyn, but most people in the Western world thought that the communist system was fundamentally bad, and ours was at least all right. And in many thought it was fundamentally good. And gosh, that made that easy for politicians. It wasn't a good situation for the people of Poland and East Germany and things, but it held us together. And you're a great expert on this, of course. Do we have a common enemy now? And if we don't, how can we forge a unity when unity is so dependent on the idea of an enemy, unfortunately? And you crack off. You're the historian of...
So I feel there are several common enemies and we've discussed one sort of glancingly today, and one a little bit more. And one of them is the challenge that comes from religious fanaticism, particularly in the form of Islamic fanaticism, and the other is the challenge that comes from anti-democratic ideologies, which promote a very different view of how society should be organized. And I would think that in facing both threats right now, they come from Russia. I mean, they may in the future come from China, but also from religious fanatics. I would think that we would be able to, look back, look at what unites us, look at the religious roots of what unites us, but also at the political roots of what unites us, and we would be able to fight back against those two enemies. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. I think there are too many divided views about, who's the real enemy. I often hear Russia placed in opposition to Islam. We should fight one or the other. Yeah. But I really think that by defending what the fundamental values of our societies are, we can see that these are both challenges. But in the end, the defense is not going to be that it's all about fighting enemies. The end is going to be reasserting what we are and remembering what we are, and it really, by doing that we'll defeat them both.
I think I'd add to the list of enemies with which I agree, moral torpor and indifference, because that is a huge threat. And the difference with the Cold War is that I think you characterized it very well, Charles. Now, however, we have a fragmenting, more multipolar world. So the challenge is a challenge to be constructive, to be co-evolutionary. There's an end to hegemonic dreams of being able to impose the same institutions that we had at the end of the Second World War on the whole globe. There's got to be a new accommodation with some of the rising powers. We do miss Mrs. Thatcher, don't we? I mean, in this context, it was in this hall, actually, at a lunch. She suddenly leant over to me and grasped my hand and said, "Don't touch the duck pate, Bishop. It's very fattening." We really need that clarity.
Jonathan.
Well, I am slightly against the need for enemies. The person who intellectually made the case was a guy called Carl Schmitt, who was a fascist, and I have a problem with that. I have a problem with anyone who reduces humanity to a war of the children of light against the children of darkness, because that always ends in tears. Our greatest enemy is a simple failure of self-belief. To be true to ourselves, to be true to our past and extraordinary historic traditions by which we're surrounded here. And when we own our past, we can give that on, together with the gift of identity and self-confidence, to our children and generations yet unborn. We have a wonderful and magnificent country here, as does the United States, both of which managed to incorporate within their national ethos huge ranges of immigrants and refugee seekers, each group of which added something to the total culture. It's a very embracing culture. If you have confidence in who you are, you can face the future and all your potential, not enemies but friends, without fear. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, when I was asked to be chairman of this particular panel, I was worried that because it's about what the West stand for, we could just talk about absolutely bloody everything. And in fact, that is what we have done, and it's been marvelously successful. I think our panel has mastered the capacity to bring so many threads together and see a way through it and provoke all the questions that need to be asked and to answer at least some of them. So will you join me in thanking them very much for their